All right, welcome to the Science of Logic, the second discussion I'm having here with another instructor from the Science of Logic course. Should be no stranger to many of you who watch my channel, Daniel Garner of O.G. Rose. Daniel and I have had several conversations before. I think our first conversation was on absolute knowledge. We also had a conversation series with the philosophy of lack. And with this conversation focused on the science of logic, continuing on from my conversation with Layman Pascal, which you can find on my channel already. We want to set the scene a little bit for the types of conversations we would like to dig deeper on as we go into the Science of Logic course. And sort of set up some big questions and explore some conversations in a very open way about conversations that we think are relevant to think about as we go into the Science of Logic course. And you wrote a piece, an article recently on your blog for OG Rose, on which I drew a lot of inspiration for this conversation. The main reason being I felt like it touched on many themes in your philosophical background, which I think you're going to be bringing up in your own course, your own contribution to the Science of Logic course. I also appreciated the way that the depths to which you demonstrated the way in which Science of Logic is a foundational text, and the way in which this foundational text actually informs a lot of, let's say, Enlightenment or Counter-Enlightenment thought. So to preface this idea specifically about the Counter-Enlightenment, I want to bring up a quote from Slavoj Žižek in Less Than Nothing, where he literally says, quote, in German idealism, the night of the world is used to contrast the Enlightenment notion of the light of reason dispelling the surrounding darkness, end quote.
Right.
So this idea here is that in German idealism, this night or this core of negativity, what comes up immediately in Hegel's Science of Logic as the obverse being and nothing, becomes very core to understanding subjectivity in Hegel, and that this is a counter position to traditional notions of the Enlightenment, namely that the Enlightenment notion of the light of reason. And I know that this is something that comes up heavily in your own work, specifically comparing and contrasting the way in which we think about reason and truth. You know, the true is not the rational. And so this core of subjectivity as the truth, in some sense, this negativity as the truth, to which if our reason, to use terms that you will frequently bring up in your philosophy, to use autonomous rationality to cover up, let's say, this darkness, to use autonomous rationality to defend against this darkness, and to keep reason alive to the truth, is, I think, something that is foundational for the Hegelian dialectic, really what Hegel's going for. If there's like one simple way in which I could summarize Hegel's philosophy as it relates to the science of logic, he's basically trying to bring us to an understanding of the relationship between the concept and truth, or reason and truth. And so I know that's very much at the center of your philosophical work as well. So I just wanted to give that as a little bit of an introduction. But Daniel, you wrote this piece, Counter-Enlightenment. Why don't you just give us the overview of what you were going for with this, and specifically the way you were using science of logic here?
Well, Dr. Cadellas, I always look forward to speaking with you. I'm always quite impressed with your introductions and how well you frame everything. So thank you for that. And indeed, the truism and the rational is a very important concept that I think fits in here very well. There was a movement of thought that basically nobody liked, and everyone tried their best to forget about it because it suggested the Enlightenment could never be a totalized, finished project. And nobody likes that stuff because the brain is naturally in the business of trying to get a complete system, a totalizing vision, and any movement of thought that wants to suggest, hey, that's not possible. Not that thought is bad or reason is bad. It's always going to have some sort of essential incompleteness that you can never deal with. Forget that stuff. That's really sad. So this movement was ignored. One of the great thinkers that did his best to try to recover it was a man named Isaiah Berlin, and he was a brilliant man. And he went back through and started with the thinking of Giambattista Vico, who wrote a book called The New Science, which is an extraordinary text. He went back and he tried to recover the thinking of Mr. Herder, Mousy. He also, and then of course, this ties in very well with the Scottish Enlightenment. So you had this huge movement of thought that wanted to always warn people that there was always something out of reach of rationality, of which made rationality possible. And if you ignored that, well, then your rationality would overreach. Anything that challenged the rationality would immediately be squashed with political power or rationalization or whatever, and it would become a force of terror. And so all of these thinkers warned about that. But you see, unfortunately, usually the centers of power, the colleges, the political systems, the corporations, they love to think that whatever their ideas are can be totalized into a final system to run everything and make everyone's life better. So this thought was not exactly taught. This thought was not exactly pushed, nor was it considered. And this leads all the way up into what I like to call the modern Counter-Enlightenment, which I think there was a number of thinkers, such as Maurice Blondel, Pavlo Filinsky, Alfred Korobowski, Michel Plonier, and I can keep going, all of which are thinkers who are like, hey, self-relating identity, or A is A thinking, always has to be leaving out a difference or a dimension of knowing that it requires to even be possible. And if you ignore that, you're going to have a lot of trouble. Now, post-modernity, in a response to the totalizing projects of modernity, tends to be what we consider the reaction against A is A thinking and totalizing visions, and that's where you get deconstruction, and there's a lot of good that comes out of that critique. But the reason why post-modernity and, say, the Counter-Enlightenment are different is because post-modernity is actually still operating as a critique of AA totalization. It is a deconstruction of AA thinking. Whereas the Counter-Enlightenment, in the modern Counter-Enlightenment, in the Scottish and those thinkers, are not just deconstructing self-relating identity or an autonomous rationality, but they are negating, sublating it into an entirely different way of thinking. And they certainly see the need for this way of thinking. And if this way of thinking is not taken seriously, then you're going to end up, say, in Alfred Korobowski, you're going to end up with he wrote a book called Science and Sanity that warned that the Aristotelian principle of A is A would cause terrible mental health problems. And you see in Florensky, it's either an identity that has a communal ontology or it's insanity. You have Blondel that notes that if we don't realize that thinking is always in a concert with action, then thinking is going to deny that it is always situated within an already occurring action and will be in service of that action without realizing it, and calls for us to instead act as opposed to just being carried on by action, which then connects with, say, Michel Plonier and personal knowledge on the need for tactile knowledge. What's extraordinary to me, I think it was Richard Rorty, and maybe it was Foucault, who once said that at the end of one's philosophical work, you reach the end of the road and find Hegel already standing there. And it turns out that Hegel, basically in the Science of Logic, starts off kind of going, guys, if you derive your categories of thought from the phenomenon that you're using on those phenomena to understand, that's kind of circular, right? Because if it's like Heidegger's kind of hermeneutic circle, right? Where you're already interpreting the text in a moment, you can't access the moment. Well, likewise, if you are using the categories derived from, say, a red apple to understand that's a red apple, well, then it's a circular logic there. You have a kind of circular problem that you're operating at. So he's like, all identity, in order to be meaningful, has to refer to something outside of it. So rationality cannot be autonomous and have any sort of meaning. And what ends up happening is because rationality makes something intelligible to you, it instantly conceals the fact that it is reliant on something outside of itself that I call a truth to make itself meaningful. And it's very, very fast. So the moment you look at a phenomenon and derive the categories to understand that phenomenon from the phenomenon, it's gone. Like this slip of the hand is gone instantaneously, and you don't even notice that it occurred, right? Well, Hegel's like, wait, you need to pay attention to that thing that just occurred, right? Because if you don't, your entire logic is going to be stuck in the realm of, I believe, understanding, which is just splitting things apart, existing in dichotomies, and not seeing a relation between these two different principles of, say, the truth of the apple in its very being, and the categories by which you understand the apple. You're not going to see that relation because there's going to be an instantaneous covering. So the Science of Logic ends up being a foundational text of which is pointing to a need to have a way of logic that is not just based on, say, Aristotelian self-identity. And he even makes a point in the introduction of the Science of Logic to be like, you know, guys, if we're using the same logic we were after 2,000 years with Aristotle, it's not that he was wrong. It's just that I would certainly hope that spirit has elevated itself to a place where we could use a need for an update in those logical principles. And frankly, what's extraordinary, and then I'll give it back to you, is that what the Counter-Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, all these people understood and point out in different ways, is that not only do you need that update because spirit has, say, elevated to a place where it needs new logics, but if you don't, the consequences are dire. You get a total state. You get pathologies. You get what's popularly called in these cycles the meaning crisis and different things like that. You get these sort of pathologies that develop, all of which stem from a failed understanding of how it is we know things and what it is to know those things. And if we don't, I guess you could say move, I think, if you don't move from understanding to reflection, where you are constantly re-understanding the thing in light of the concepts that are derived from, the categories derived from it, and then working beyond those categories only to fail again, but then try again and to keep working in that state of reflection. If you do not do that, there are some very, very serious consequences that come out. So what's extraordinary to me is, I guess I would say, there's that old question of what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? It's almost like, what does Scotland have to do with Germany? Turns out a lot. Turns out they have a lot to do with one another. And that Hegel, far from just someone making some sort of totalizing system or whatever like that, is creating a new way of approaching logic and ultimately philosophy proper that is going to be moving beyond Aristotelian self-identity. So he fits, so because Hegel's always ahead of us, it's, you know, he fits beautifully in this forgotten tradition of in my opinion, forgotten tradition of the Counter-Enlightenment, Scottish Enlightenment, and the modern Counter-Enlightenment.
Right. I mean, I think there's so much there between this. I mean, two things. I mean, there's this oscillation between modernity, broadly speaking, as characterized by totalizing systems or totalizing narratives. You have the deconstructive move in post-modernity, where there's a sort of emphasis on multiplicity of multiplicities. Multiplicities without any connection to a one. And then you have this emphasis on Aristotelian logic, which functions basically in terms of, let's say, a system of categories, which does not necessarily tell you how they were derived, why they were derived, and they're basically their value function for truth.
Right.
You know, and I think that where Hegel comes into this weird picture is, you know, sort of a really heavy emphasis on not only dialectical logic, because dialectical logic was very active in Plato's work. Dialectical logic was very active in Kant's work, but the way in which Hegel develops the dialectic is always internal to the concept. And I think that when it comes to Plato and Kant, Hegel's saying that they weren't able to go far enough to the inwardness of the concept to understand the concept in itself, that they get stuck in certain categories, or they get stuck in an idea outside of themselves in Plato's case. So, you know, as you were saying, this leads us from the understanding to deeper levels of reflection beyond our initial categories that we derive of being and stuff like that. The problem with that actually can get quite scary, is that people have to go deeper into to sort of confronting their own self-reflection, which can be terrifying. And I think that actually is something that I want to stress personally when I teach the course, is that yes, I mean, Hegel does require a certain bar in terms of your capacity to sort of intellectually comprehend him, but there is also a certain way in which confronting yourself and confronting the certain negativities that can come up when you no longer have that totalizing system, can be sort of disarming for some people. Understandably in many cases. Now, in your piece on the Counter-Enlightenment here, situating this as sort of like, I almost think about it as like an alternative path, a path that wasn't taken, during the Enlightenment. There's a conflict that you bring up at the beginning of your paper, between Bergson and Whitehead and Einstein. This division here that you bring up seems to me to be a central one. Might be interesting to tease out a little bit more. So, as it relates to logic. So, it seems to me like, on the one hand, Bergson and Whitehead are saying that the experience of time cannot be replaced with a block universe, and that the block universe of Einstein and the block universe is complete, whereas our experience of time is fundamentally incomplete. And that you say Einstein might be a type of autonomous rationality here with the block universe. So how do you understand this debate? I've always been interested in this debate, but I'd be really interested in how you understand this debate in the context of Counter-Enlightenment.
Excellent. And I'll warn you, I am no expert on any of those thinkers, and I feel like I'm a novice in the beginning of learning them. But it has become very clear to me that debate is actually a big freaking deal in this movement. A few more things. Indeed, when one goes into Hegel and encounters the complexity of the language, it could be very disarming. One of the things that have made me sympathetic to it is because if one tries to do creative writing and literally describe everything in this room, you will find it is a remarkably difficult undertaking without making incredibly complex sentences that are hard to read. Most of the time when you read a story, you actually just get a kind of simulation of the room, not the full description. Well, if you're Hegel and you're literally talking about thought that escapes the categories by which we operate in thought, pre-categorization, it is not going to be easy. And so that one should have I think it's important to have sympathy for the difficulty of the undertaking, especially when you consider how hard it is to actually just describe anything well. We actually very rarely pay attention to how poorly we describe things. Like, truly try to describe a mailbox. Do it without using a photograph. It's really hard. Well, if we're talking about describing the movement of the concept, well, frick, without categorization, this will be hard. And so we have to be understanding of that. And indeed, the Counter-Enlightenment can be seen as a road that is not taken. Now, there seems to be a lot of people online who are like, hey, we should check out that eternal origin guy. Hey, we should take out the Goring quality guy. There's some people that are looking back at some of these resources, and they're also getting outside the Western lens, looking at the Kyoto School and these different things, and that seems to be a valuable direction. But this path certainly was not taken because in all honesty, the moment you start saying that AA logic is incomplete, it kind of sounds crazy, right? It's like, what do you friggin' mean? A is incomplete. A cup is a cup. Like, A is A. It sounds kind of nuts. So it's understandable that there would be this moving away from that path. But now it's becoming clear that we need to reconsider it. To the Einstein debate. So apparently, Einstein, in a lot of the formulations that he does, assumes certain geometrical axioms by which to have the curvature of the universe, and from that you get his theory of relativity, right? There's a certain assumption of which seems, as I understand it, that assumption is based somewhat on believing that mathematics is not created but realized, right? So if you can arrive at mathematics that shows that the curvature could be X, Y, or Z, the very fact you arrived at that would thus give you reason to assume it, right? Because mathematics is not created; it's realized, right? Okay, well, if you buy that and you buy that assumption, well, then general relativity can emerge, as Einstein says, right? Well, that's accepting categories, pre-existing categories, right? That's what Hegel's warning you about. And it was funny kind of reviewing this. So apparently, like, the whole thing with Whitehead is he's like, hey, you assume that. How can you assume that? And maybe that's not the best explanation. And if we're having so much trouble, I mean, right now, and the guy who I've come to really like, and I try to watch all of his stuff, the Footnotes to Plato guy who does a lot on Bergson and Whitehead, he's really an interesting fellow. He was kind of like, we right now know that Einstein's general relativity doesn't account for all phenomena in the universe, right? We know that we're having trouble putting it together with quantum mechanics, and we know that we're like having to talk about this weird stuff called dark matter. So is it so crazy to think that maybe we need to go back to this Whitehead-Bergson debate and reconsider it and to rethink about it? Now, the reason why Bergson seems to be very, very interesting is because instead of having a doctrine where in Einstein it's like time is relative to space, it's almost, as I understand it, where in Bergson space is an expression of time, where time is primary and space is simply the blueprint of time, as Mr. Eber put in one of the net discussions, which I think is a lovely way to put it. And that time simply becomes the unfolding of relation and different things. Now, the reason why that's very important is because if time is essential to being as opposed to space, well, then right there you have the nature of things is more becoming, right? As opposed to being. Whereas if you believe space is primary, well, then you don't really need reflection. You just need understanding in Hegel. You just need to divide things up in space, figure out where one space begins and the other does not, and there you go, right? But if indeed relations are ontological, as a lot of people in the intellectual dark web stress and can explain better than me, but if that is the case, well, then you have, dare I say, a scientific theoretical framework that there would be reason to think the Counter-Enlightenment, all of these different thinkers are justified, right? But you see, if Einstein is right, well, then it would seem like going in the direction of these Counter-Enlightenment thinkers is kind of silly, right? Because look, the science says it's a block universe. All this stuff about A-B logic, well, that doesn't make much sense, right? Because look, the science says block universe. But if that's not true, well, that would give a lot of imperative to take this philosophical tradition that's going to put a lot more emphasis on time, becoming, and versions of logic that are not autonomous, that are always unfolding and developing, as opposed to non-contingently being the case. And so I think that debate, if indeed one can see reason to question Einstein, would certainly give imperative to considering this alternative tradition more seriously. So that's why I think that those are what I would say are some of the stakes of that debate.
Right. It's so fascinating. We could get into some of the inner details there because, when it comes to, of course, it's well known that general relativity and quantum mechanics don't play well, let's say, and that there needs to be some sort of reconciliation, which involves probably totally new formalisms of both. When it comes to quantum mechanics, one of the things is that the types of phenomena it describes are so counterintuitive to our experience of time, and then, you're sort of emphasizing here that where Bergson and Whitehead come in is perhaps with an emphasis more to our sort of experience of time. So I think this is an interesting debate in terms of course, we're not going to get too far into specifically solving these problems, but just to frame for listeners sort of, on the one hand, you can have these diametrically opposed conceptual systems in physics, which require some sort of dialectical mediation to sort of bring in Hegelian language, and that part of this dialectical mediation does involve, we might assume, some sort of relationship to how humans experience, how what is our experience of space and time, and how does that play some role, a deeper role in the way we conceptualize.
Well, and I'll just add to
theories.
that, a key component of this entire counter movement is that all of it is radically anti-reductionist. Like they're all emergentist, if we use that term that I know goes around now. All of them are saying you cannot get to, and Hegel would be as well. He's an anti-reductionist. All of these people, like especially like Planier and personal knowledge, like I think he even uses the term at some point of emergent, being an emergentist or something like that. Like all of them are saying you cannot arrive at your understanding of the universe by reducing it to its part. Well, that means you have to treat observation, subjectivity, and all of that as a variable in your system, and thus reconstituting the system, interacting with the system, and all of that. And basically, again, one of the reasons probably why this tradition is so ignored is because, boy, howdy, stuff gets tough if you have to take emergentism seriously. Like a reductionism, you kind of know what to do, right? You have a sense of what to do. But when you start talking like complexity, that, you know, how these interrelating parts, things get tough. So the brain just wants pleasure. You mentioned that in one of your talks, it doesn't want truth. There's a pleasure in the control that comes from reducing, because there's almost something like pleasurable about reducing things. Because you have like a power over them, right? It's like, yes, you are the parts. Yes, I know what you are. So there's a kind of pathology there, and you have a sense of what to do. But once you start talking about something more emergent, well, that's crazy. And that then suggests where Hegel in the introduction is like, philosophy still hasn't even figured out its method yet. That's why we're here. We're going to figure out its method, because what is the method of being non-reductionist? And so that would be another component, I'd say, of the movement.
Right, absolutely. I suppose, you know, there's also a way in which I'd like to bring in reflection again. That also, you know, one of the dimensions I think that characterizes the reductionist worldview, so called, is the way in which it seems like reflection becomes epiphenomenal or secondary. And I don't know, insofar as I've heard people in the emergentist worldview go into the actual dynamics of reflection, but when you include subjectivity, I think this is the crucial thing. When you include subjective reflection into the entire process of modeling and conceptualization, again, yeah, it gets a lot more existentially terrifying than when you simply could have, like, for example, a model of the block universe, for example, or a model of the wave function, for that matter, you know. So I think in both situations, in some sense. But, you know, you go into, maybe let's go to really to the core, I think, of the modern counter-enlightenment. We've already touched a little bit on Aristotle, but it seems to be central. So, like, in, you know, when you define the modern counter-enlightenment and name some of the crucial figures, like you've already mentioned, you know, like Maurice Blondel, Benjamin Fondane, Alfred Whitehead, the list goes on. It seems like what's central is this this critique on hard objectivity. Namely, an objectivity, and this is connected to, I think, what we just talked about, is like there's this objectivity without a subject. And I think that, you know, this derives from Aristotle, ultimately, this hard objectivity. And so I think a lot, and, you know, and a lot's at stake here, because Hegel's also, in some sense, an objectivist, an objectivist of the concept, though, right, which is, I think, different than the hard objectivity of Aristotle. But Hegel's really accepting the Kantian turn to subjectivism, but then he's saying that Kant didn't derive the objectivity of the concept, basically. And so if you could go in a little bit more on what you understand of hard objectivity, and what's, you know, what's at stake with this move of including the subject in such a way as that we get a different type of objectivity.
Magnificent. You know, I always like to think of the word objectivity as object. So, you know, objects are objective. So if you could be an object, you could get to the objective truth. And it's funny because, you know, words are sticky. Objective means goal. So the goal then becomes to become an object as a human being. Well, that is inherently subjective. And how would you experience the world as an object, right? Well, the assumption there is that actually you would find the truth if you indeed experience the world as objects. But what's quite funny is that Hegel seems to suggest that, well, you are assuming that therefore subjectivity does not somehow have a participatory role in objects. Now, this is where it becomes fascinating. And this is where the entire science of logic becomes very interesting. Because, so there's one way in which we have the phenomenology of spirit, right? So we're going, okay, this is a phenomenology. But what's so funny is that, and Dr. Holgate mentions this, is that philosophy and phenomenology are kind of different. You know, philosophy proper is different from phenomenology. And so Hegel's gone through and he said, this is a phenomenology that we have undergone through history. What do you mean, a phenomenology? He's like, yeah, a. Are you so sure it's the phenomenology? Which would mean you only had one phenomenology that you had to go through? Because then the question becomes, what are the metaphysical conditions that make possible our phenomenology as itself, where it would unfold the way that it did? And how do we know that it had to be that phenomenology of, say, A, B logic, and we've talked about all that, as opposed to another phenomenology, right? If you assume that it couldn't have been a different phenomenological unfolding, how'd you get there? What are the conditions by which you were right? Maybe you're right, but one would have to do the work to try to figure out what are the conditions to themselves that made possible that phenomenological unfolding. What? What in the world are you talking about at that point? Now, a few things on this. This is where, for me, if Hegel is trying to think, in a sense, pre-categorical, then there's something here where common life, in the experience of common life, is really, really important. Because common life in the kind of Scottish tradition is more like a story unfolding. It's not really categorization. It's paying attention to how things unfold, how they develop, how they become themselves, and how you know them and how they become themselves. It's not merely chopping up. Like, common life is not where you chop up the world into your categories. It's where you meet the world on its own terms. Okay, Hegel's like, you got to make that move. You got to understand phenomenology before you can do the science of logic. You've got to really pay attention to common life. And it is only from a place of common life, which is deeply tied to the phenomenological, that one has any chance of stepping into considerations of the conditions that make possible that phenomenology as itself. Well, once you do that, you have to start going, okay, what is it that occurs before the category arises by which I know the thing? What is it that is unfolding before and under, per se, the category by which I know things? Well, that's very different from, say, objectivity, which objectivity assumes that you can arrive at the truest understanding by being like an object, of which just happens to align with the categories by which you define object. Oh, there's a bit of a circular problem right there. So this is what ends up happening. And this is why there's such a problem with objectivity, is because we define, okay, so being objective means that you're able to determine what color a thing is, not what you think the color is, but what it actually is, where you're able to determine what the composition of it is, not what you think the composition is, but it actually is. And you start going down the list on object categories, right? Here's the problem. All of those categories were derived from the object itself and then put back on the object. So that's a circular problem. And so that's why you have such a problem with objectivity, because there's this quick bait and switch that occurs when you have these traditions of objectivity, where the very categories that define what it means to be objective are derived from the objects themselves, but they don't come from the objects. They're imposed on the objects, and then we tell ourselves that they came from the object. So it's a bait and switch. And that's where in the True and the Rational paper, the problem is the moment you experience truth in a way you understand, you translate it into rational terms to make it seem like it was always rational. The moment you experience happiness and say, I am happy, well, now it feels like happiness is a rational concept because I've put it in a certain box. No, no, no. Rationality just ran in really quickly, kind of consumed and ate the experience, and then reduced it to that concept so that we could understand it. But there's a very quick movement there that you have to catch, that if you don't catch, you're not going to analyze what you need to analyze. So a phenomenology arises out of certain conditions, but there had to have been those conditions to make possible that phenomenology, but only by examining very closely how that phenomenology unfolds would you even know what to look at or how to search to begin the question of getting to philosophy proper, which is always a loaded phrase. So objectivity, basically what ends up happening is the goal of objectivity is a red herring, basically, is a way to put it. We go, oh, if we look for objectivity, we will get the truth, right? It's a distraction. It's you're just stuck in this hermeneutical circle. I almost want to call it the category circle or something. You're like stuck in this kind of circle thinking you're making progress, but you're actually just running in a loop. And then the problem is all the counter-enlightenment thinkers are, not only are you running in a loop, you're creating, in the process of running in that loop, you're immobilizing the state, you're increasing the size of corporations, you're creating mass boredom, and there are real practical consequences that happen as you're running in that categorical circle as you're doing. So this mistake is very practically consequential. And that's what they're all pushing for. So generally, the search for objectivity becomes a red herring to understanding how to move beyond or to understand the constitution of that circular problem.
Yeah. And I just want to, what I'm running through in my head are just examples, very practical examples that might help people realize really what's at stake in this type of Hegelian logic in a way that identifies things that are like, let's say, large-scale cultural conflicts. Like, I've got a few examples, between what I would call scientific objectivity versus Hegelian objectivity. So, in terms of scientific objectivity, let's say like the debate between the round earthers and the flat earthers. Now, so the round earthers are the scientific objectivity. Look, the earth is objectively round, and the flat earthers are saying, no, they're trying to use this scientific hard objectivity to say, no, the earth is objectively flat. Now, it's very easy for someone in the scientific mind state or just common sense at this point to sort of say, for example, look, the earth is objectively round. But wait a second. If we're thinking about objectivity on the level of the concept, if we're thinking about the coming to be of objectivity, actually, if you look at all of the ancient world maps and descriptions of the earth, it's like flat with a dome.
Yep.
That would be a phenomenological map of the earth. And that actually is, there is a way in which a flat conception with a dome is more true to experience than the sort of hard objectivity which claims to abstract away all subjective experience as such and just give us the counterintuitive view that the earth is round. Right? But now, so what am I saying here? Am I saying that the flat earthers have a point? Not really. What I'm saying is that because science doesn't include the subject, because science doesn't include the coming to be of a conceptual objectivity, it doesn't understand actually the way in which the world is experienced by a subject, and that has consequences. That has consequences on the scale of global cultural conflict. Now, what would be the resolution for a Hegelian objectivity standpoint? It would be probably analyzed as a symptom, like this flat earth, round earth thing. It could be analyzed as a symptom of science not understanding personal self-mapping well enough, for example. That's just a random idea, but it brings us to this. It brings us to a higher level of cultural conflict than simply the hard scientific objectivity on the one hand, and then the subjectivist illusions on the other hand. Another example is with the phenomenon of aliens in the 20th century. Like, there are a lot of people that see aliens, have alien sightings and stuff like that. And then you have hard scientific objectivity saying, no, there's no actual hard. But then in the coming to be of, I think, conceptual objectivity, we have to have a different view on what these alien sightings could be or represent internal to the coming to be of people's concepts. Not saying, again, that there's reflection of an external substance, but that's kind of not really the point in some sense when it comes to conceptual objectivity. I just wanted to give those examples maybe to get people thinking about the difference between sort of scientific objectivity and Hegelian objectivity.
I think that's magnificent. I'll just comment on it. I think Pajot is quite correct when he says that the ancient world would put priority on the phenomenological worldview as opposed to the objective worldview. So maps are phenomenological mappings. Myths are phenomenological mappings. Stories are phenomenological mappings, of which are important. Because if you throw out phenomenological mappings and you say, this is what the world is made of compositionally in terms of objects. Okay, what about my children? Well, yeah, good luck. So you get this very strange kind of pathological relationship where the scientific worldview is kind of denying the existence of the phenomenological worldview, which is kind of true, but it does so in a way that doesn't take ownership for the way that it has kind of cornered the human subject to trying to figure out how to live their lives, right? It's like it doesn't consider that. And instead, if you as a human subject say, I don't know if I'm just a collection of atoms, you're almost you're black sheep is almost a kind of scapegoating. It's like, well, you're just stupid. You're just a dumb fundamentalist, right? So, you know, a movement from the pre-modern world to the modern world can be in somewhat seen as a movement of having the primacy go to the phenomenological worldview, and then under that, the scientific worldview, to then switching it, right? And of course, switching it gives you what Dietrich Miklowski, starting in 1670, will call the great enrichment, the economic project, industrialization, and all the benefits that come with that. Well, now we've got to learn. Now you're starting to see where we're overfitting the map, right? You're taking it too far. You're becoming reductionistic. So how do you come at where they're more even, right? Like, how do you work to a thing where they have a dialect? That's the challenge. And that's really, really hard. And here's the thing. There's basically, to make a very bold claim, there's basically no way to do that with AA logic. There's no way to do that with AA logic. You must have a AB logic, something Hegelian, in order to have it come together. Because you have to see otherness as essential to identity. Myth and science have to see one another as essential to the identity of the other. Phenomenology, objectivity, and this is where stuff gets crazy. But the whole Counter-Enlightenment can be seen as people who saw this coming, or who knew that something like this would be needed. Maybe not in the same way, maybe not to the same brilliance of a Hegel, but there was a sense of this problem.
Right. I think I just want to emphasize here that in this dialectic between phenomenal mappings and scientific objectivity, I still think that Hegel will be on the side of the scientific objectivity. Sure. He just wants to include the phenomenal becoming and get to a proper standpoint of logic. And I think if anyone wants to really dive deeply into that, I think he makes that point and makes that case really well in the preface of the Phenomenology of Spirit, that the whole point of the Phenomenology of Spirit in some sense was to get you through the phenomenological process to contemplate logic, you know, and I suppose that these pure forms of logic, which are themselves the product of the coming to be of the subject, and so you get this anyway conceptual objectivity. But in regards to when we use AA and AB, and I've used this logic in my thesis as well, I think as it relates to Aristotle and Hegel, I and maybe I'll throw it back to you to get commentary on this, but my understanding is because I am also concerned with the way in which the proposition AB can become AA.
Yes, of course.
So,
yes.
so I just want to. So I want to say that very practically, day-to-day life, so to speak, what we mean when we say AA or AB is the difference between the law of identity and the law of contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
And really, what we're doing with AB is absolutizing contradiction.
Yes,
I think that's my understanding
sure.
of the move. So how would you respond to that? And the point is that to absolutize contradiction forces you to keep your identity in a and most importantly, an inward contradiction, and almost an imminent inward contradiction of your own conceptual self-becoming.
Yes. Excellent. A few things. Hegel is absolutely quote unquote progressive, as in, you know, there is a progress that's going on. The issue is that progress must kind of conserve what came before it, or the parts of it that are going to help that progress. So indeed, he is more on the side of science than, say, a raw autonomous phenomenological view of the world. The issue, he's like, but at the same time, you do know there's like a subject, right? You have to include that. So, and that's very important. Hegel is not like a conservative, or in a sense of, or a traditionalist, but he's also, just in the same way that I would argue most of the Counter-Enlightenment people are not either, even if they can sound that way. They basically are warning, like, you know, I guess Herder or someone would be like, hey, if you want to progress technologically, you always just have to make sure that technology doesn't try to replace tradition and trial and error and things that we've learned from experience. Because the moment you do that, if you think your technology has made you smarter than history, that's precisely when you're going to fall into history, right? So the progress always has to conserve what has come before and have memory. And so on and so forth. But to what you're saying on A and AB, very, very important that the AB logic requires the AA logic as a step in its understanding. So when we talk about contradiction in Hegel, we are not talking about logical contradiction, which is like 2 + 2 = 5, right? That's a logical contradiction. And Dr. McGowan makes this point. I think it's very important. By contradiction, what you are saying is that, well, this can bring us to the being and nothing, right? Like in order for me to say that this is an apple, I understand this concept as an apple because it relates to things that are not apples, right? And therefore, I know how to position this as an apple. Well, that would mean A is A entails, in order to have definition as itself, A does not equal A. The negative of the concept has to be included in the syllogism in order for the syllogism to make sense. Well, that means identity has a contradictory function, because if A is only meaningful to the extent that you understand A is not A, well, then that's a contradiction, right? And yet what's funny is the contradiction is not a logical contradiction because it is not bound together in objective space, but between your understanding of the phenomenon in its object and your idea of it. The contradiction arises in the effort to understand it. But the understanding, because it divides being and nothing so quickly, hides the fact that you are doing that until you reflect on it. And that's the movement from understanding to reflection. We go, wait a minute, in order for being and nothing to have any sort of notion of identity, I have to separate them when they always must be together. And if they're always together, there is always a becoming. Now, this is all very abstract, but to help explain it and then to bring it to why I think the A is B formulation is better. Imagine you had a house, okay? You have a house on a street, and I would ask you, what is that? And you said it's a house. The reason I know what a house is because I know what a community is. And the reason I know what a community is because I know what a nation state is. And I know what roads are and all these different things, right? Imagine that house was the only thing in the universe and there was nothing else, just the house. And I would say, that's a house. You'd have no idea what that means, because that's all there is. There's just the house. Right? It would be more sensible to say there's a door, like to start pointing at the points of the house or different things. But you see, the idea of a house, in order to be sensible to you, is actually inherently caught up in an entire network of relations to communities and other ways of doing, in the entire way that you do things. A house is where you live. Well, even the word live doesn't make any sense if there's not multiple places where you can live. If there's only one place you can live, well, then the word live is just be or whatever, right? So all of our understandings of what a house is contingent upon being in relation with other phenomenon that are not the house, right? And here's the thing. When you work to understand what a house is, that means you're making it become a thing that exists in that network as you move it into understanding, so you can define what the house is, right? So you say that house is a house, A is A. In that observation of the phenomenon, to understand it, you then bring it to yourself where it gains that understanding, because now it's in your head, which situates it in an entire network of things that it is not. And therefore, that means, in a sense, you're pulling the phenomenon into a network of things that it isn't. So A is A always requires B. The thing always requires what it is not in order to be itself as you understand it. But you see, if you just have self-relating identity, which is what is represented by A as A, then in your head, you deny the act where you pull it into a network of relations to understand it. You just think that it is a house. Look, it's a freaking house. It's just right there. It's a house. It's just relating to itself. It tells you in what it is, right? But it doesn't actually. You pull it into yourself and relate it to a bunch of things that it is not in order to make sense of it. Other ways to put this. The word house, and this is where you get into like Korbaska, S.A. Hauerwas, maybe even Cardinal Newman. The word house is not the phenomenon of house. The word is not the thing. The word water is not wet, right? And yet, when I say water, so instantaneously does the memory of the phenomenon of water enter the head that it's as if to us the word water is in fact water, and it is wet. And we forget that the word is not the thing. So A does not equal B, but you require the word in the concept to make sense of the phenomenon as itself, right? Because if you didn't have the word or the concept of water, well, then the phenomenon would just, who knows? It would just be there as a sort of a raw phenomenon, something that a pure experience in a kind of Kyoto sense. So in order to make things intelligible, we are always transposing them or making them something that they are not in order to understand them. Now, here's the big move, of course. A lot of people say, well, of course, we call that representing. The idea of water represents the phenomenon of water. And Hegel just comes along and says, how do you know that? Where did you derive that from? How do you know that the thought of water is merely representing the phenomenon as opposed to somehow in that very iteration working with the phenomenon itself? Now, this is where Hegel has something, and this is where we get into the wild part of Hegel that seems to be the kind of philosophy where people are like, he's an idealist. I don't think it's the case that Hegel thinks that if there were no consciousness, there'd be no universe. He doesn't seem to be saying that at all, because science and materialism is very real. But he seems to be saying that the way phenomenon unfold is intricately connected with thinking and with ideas and our way to understand it. And this is the crux of something very profound, I think.
He says, I think, to me, reading deeply the science of logic, again, I get ideas that, to me, go quite nicely with a quantum mechanical view of things. But, my understanding is, as it relates to the status of nature and Hegel's idealism, is that it's not that if there was no consciousness or there was no specifically human subjectivity or the concept, it's not that if that didn't exist, there would be no nature. It's that nature would have no intrinsic intelligibility.
Right.
It's that the intelligibility comes from us, basically. The intelligibility comes from us. I think that nature in itself just seems to lack a certain what appears to us from the conceptual side as something dense and impenetrable and massive is actually something attributed by our own conceptual intellectual processes. I think that's one way to see it. I wanted to also make a comment on Hegel and progressivism, because it is true that Hegel is a type of progressivist. There is a progress in Hegel, sublation, idealization, and so forth. One important thing to note, though, however, because of the concept of absolute negativity, that and this absolute, and also the sort of absolutization of certain working with contradiction, is that progress in Hegel is a negative progress in the sense that what you're working with is increasingly intractable social dilemmas, or not only social dilemmas, but increasingly intractable dilemmas. Could be physical, could be social, and so progress in Hegel is actually when you stumble upon a new, more difficult contradiction, a more intractable problem. What actually comes up in contemporary literature, I think, oftentimes today as a wicked problem being sort of a product of complex systems which really has no final solution. Like, for example, we shouldn't imagine global warming as having some final solution. It's more a new condition of our planet, which we have to learn to live with and work with as best as we can. And solving, for example, the problem of global coordination on a problem like global warming would be an example of progress, because we've progressed to the level where we're having intractable problems on a global level, which we all have to wrestle with in China and Africa and South America and everywhere. Whereas in the 1500s, that wasn't a thing, like we weren't having, we weren't dealing with the intractable problem of global coordination in the 1500s. Right. So it's a weird type of progress, but I think that it's important to emphasize this. And also as it relates to the sort of contradiction at the core of science of logic, being and nothing, in terms of really to hit that home, I like to keep it close to the body. Let's keep it with, like, let's say sex and food, like, for example, if you take, for example, excesses of sex or excesses of food, like lust or gluttony. In some sense, what those motions are is an absolutization of being in that dimension. And you don't want to accept the nothing of it. Right. But where you wind up, if you go to the excesses of sex or food, is in nothing. So there's a way in which in Hegel, nothing comes up in being. Yes. And also being comes up in nothing. So like, for example, if you flip the determination and instead say, for example, of going into gluttony and instead of going into lust, you go into extreme fasting and extreme abstinence. That's the opposite. You've absolutized nothing. And he's saying being will come up in that. So in other words, as it relates to, like, for example, the sex drive and the food drive, you have to work with the contradiction of it, which is daily, and then you have a becoming. So I think that's really, at least, like, a practical way in which I relate to that logic. Now, I really want to talk to you about what we've talked to death, about A, B, A, but there's something really interesting you say about Deleuze, which I thought was fantastic. It introduces a new idea, and I think it logically formalizes what Hegel would call spurious infinity. And that I think is maybe something to watch out for in Deleuzean philosophy, where you say what Deleuze tries to implement is AA, BB, CC, DD, EE. Could you go into a little bit about what you mean by that? And perhaps, am I correct to make a connection here to spurious infinity?
Yes. No, that's outstanding. So a few things. One, 100% where for Hegel progress is paradoxical, and in the same way that the anemones of reason that for Kant are terrible, for Hegel are like the great accomplishment of reason. In a way, the paradoxes that we're arising today, we view are the failures of progress. In a very real way, are the successes of progress. You are rising to these great paradox and contradictions and calamities. It's like, yes, this is exactly where we have to rise to the occasion. This is exactly where we have to get to the real nature of the relation between subject and object in these very paradoxes. So there's a very funny way in which the progress is marked by these paradoxes that strike us as being the exact opposite of progress. So I think that's a very important caveat. The other thing I will note is the paper on A is A is going to argue that AB is a shorthand for A does not equal A, parentheses equals A does not equal A, parentheses without B. Okay, and B represents a self-relating negativity, which the thing is always without, but is intelligible in relation to its effort to realize that thing. Okay, so things are not what they are, being not what they are in relation to a stable identity they are always without. Okay, so the AB is a shorthand for that elongated formula, which then I think magnificent paper, The Sublation of Mathematics by Mr. Alex Ebert, gives then how you can understand this much, much better using some of the resources of mathematics. So I think that's all very, very important. And indeed, another way to think about this is, instead of like this subject object, like you're talking about quantum logic in some of the presentations on Hegel, I think that's an outstanding way to put it, because it's almost like, instead of it being idea nature, I guess would be, idea objects, it's in like, it's almost like a feedback loop, like this perpetual feedback loop. It's not categories. That's almost a lot. And I think that lines with Mr. Ebert's work. It's like a lot of the problems are categories, because categories hide from you feedback loops and makes you think that it's all either or. And there's some pretty wild thinking going on there that I think is insanely important. Now, on Deleuze. Mr. Deleuze, I think, is the logical end of post-modernity. And we do know that Zizek, in his book on Deleuze, talks about this. And I think it's indeed quite true. Deleuze wants to emphasize ontologically what I want to call essential difference, which is the idea that difference is essential, not being, right? And he's got so basically, every single entity is in itself an expression of a unique ontology. Not just a different, like an expression of a similar ontology in a different way, but down to its very, very ontological ground, it is different, right? And everything is like that. Everything is an essential difference. And the reason you have intelligibility is because of overlap, where the differences overlap, and you can therefore make, but there's no like relational connection. There's just overlap between the phenomena. Well, that means everything is an AA, BB, CC, DD. Everything is, in fact, a self-relating principle. It is just the only self-relating principle that will ever be that self-relating principle. So every single, say, the logic of AA is not the same exactly as the logic of BB or the logic of CC, but the logic is indeed all identical in being self-relating in its difference, in its uniqueness. And the reason this all has to follow is because you cannot have in Deleuze any epistemologies of representation. You can't have analogy, you can't have image, you can't have any of these things. So the only entities that are able to know themselves as themselves are themselves. And you can't have any deriving or representation of that unique ontology beyond its own expression. And here's the key. You get everything is expressing a essential difference, but that essential difference cannot be represented outside the expression. Okay, so everything has to express. The problem with this, of course, is this is a metaphysics that's very, very anti-relation, anti-relational, you can't have an A-B logic. You can't have a feedback loop. In fact, a feedback loop is a bad thing because it is a violation of every essential difference. If an essential difference is being transformed by its relation to another essential difference, then it is lost. And that's immoral. And that's a bad thing because that's a one of one, right? And so the preservation of what is fitting for every ontology is a perseverance, is a honoring of that essential difference, right? So then everything becomes very atomized, very isolationist once you start moving to the, there's a lot of individual expression. And arguably, one should understand that Deleuze is reacting to the horrors of the mob, as Dr. Hammerlich will talk about, Nazi Germany, totalization, the banality of evil. So it makes sense that you'd have a response against all of that really, really wants to emphasize essential difference in the impossibility of relation, only the possibility of overlap, because if you can't have relation, then you don't have to worry about totalization, right? Because you can't totalize everything into a relating whole and thus create the horrors of the 20th century again, right? So it's understandable where Deleuze is coming from. Unfortunately, it turns out that when you do that and you remove the possibility of intelligibility between people because you make everything an essential difference with its own essential logic that corresponds with that ontology, because ontology always has epistemological consequences, you get the meaning crisis, as everyone talks about. You get Japan. You get radical isolationism. You get the breakdown of community. You get the breakdown of relations. And so you get a lot of trouble. So although arguably Deleuze is perhaps better than some of the horrors of modernity, I would not call it optimal. It just gives rise to, unfortunately, some of the radical sort of breaking apart that you see at the sum. So that's how I would put what I mean when I talk about Deleuze as AA, BB, CC, DD, and so on.
That's very helpful. I can offer. I think this is I think it's a deep principle. I often think that really the battle that's going on at the grad school level in philosophy is like a battle between Deleuze and Lacan, and of course anyway, I could go into that a little bit, but the difference here between Deleuze and Lacan as it relates to how you're talking about essential difference, everyone expressing their essential difference, is that for Lacan, there's what he would call sexual difference. And sexual difference is actually, it's a negative because there's a difference between, there's a sexual difference. It's not a sexual unity, but it's a common difference. So Zizek flips this Deleuzian logic into Lacanian logic in regards to contemporary transgender issues. So when contemporary transgender focuses on everyone expressing your sexual essence, everyone express your unique individuality, there's a way in which what this obfuscates is the core negativity, the sexual difference, which is the very shared problem which everyone has to face no matter what gender identity you choose.
Right.
So it's not so much trying to limit people in terms of how they express their gender identity. It's more saying that no matter how you express your gender identity, you're going to have to contend with sexual difference. So this is really important to think about. And it's also, when we think about, for example, and I think it has deep consequences, like, for example, you just brought it up, and you brought it up previously, I think it's worth talking about, is, the example of Japan. What do we mean when we say Japan? Well, what we mean is, like you say, a breakdown of social relationships to sort of a withdrawal into individualism, a draw into sort of anti-social life, anti-traditional life, anti-family life. And I think Japan might be an extreme example where that's sort of happening throughout the modern world in general, the developed world in general. But I think we need to think about this problem in the context of, again, a progressive problem, meaning that we're encountering this. We didn't encounter this problem in the 15th century. Why? Because our organic relations, we were too dependent on our organic relations. So we're encountering this problem because we're in some sense freed from traditional organic relations. So there's a progress there. We're facing a new intractable problem. And we have a romantic idealization of sexuality instead of a confrontation with a sexual difference.
Right.
So these two things and then throwing into the mix advanced technology where you can sort of just, explore totally different virtual spaces without the other and so forth, or the other becomes the virtual space itself instead of, so this is all very complex. And my intuition, again, because philosophy, from a Hegelian philosophical point of view, we can't predict the future or jump ahead of our time, but sort of analyze this as, like, to me, what I'm trying to push for here is, with the example of Japan, try to analyze this almost like a successful failure. Like, this is an interesting problem to have. Like, we don't, like, for example, very concretely, like, for example, not to reveal too much personal information, but I have sort of contact with, for example, the way in which traditional familial life in a traditional religious mind frame traps, for example, and traps to a suicidal degree, for example, women's sexual expression, where they can't express themselves at all. Like, I've had direct contact with this problem, and say, for example, in the situation with Japan, we're freed from our traditional social links in that way. And now we have a burden of responsibility for deeper reflection in terms of, how do I actually work with the contradiction of sexuality? That brings you to the different level of responsibility for the unconscious. And here's my final point and this will bring it to the next question, is that for someone like Lacan, or for someone in psychoanalysis, again, bringing it back to the sexual difference concept, is that just because we have an unconscious, that doesn't mean we're not responsible for our unconscious. That's the problem, is that we're responsible for our unconscious. And so when you don't have the traditional normative authority responsible for that, I think we need to have that type of conversation. We need to have that type of conversation, is, what does it mean to be responsible for the unconscious in the modern, in the whatever world we're in? But that brings me to my next question, is that you bring up in this article the field of psychoanalysis. So you bring up Lacan, you bring up Zupancic, and this figure, these figures in the what I would call the Slovenian school of psychoanalysis. So how do you understand this field, and how do you situate this field in what you call the Counter-Enlightenment?
Magnificent. A few things. One, Deleuze will give you the true infinity in a positive way for the individual, but the problem is, in the process, he turns the society into a spurious infinity. So you don't have the problem with the spurious infinity on the individual level, which you could define as the and. But on the social level, since you don't have relation, then it's AA and BB and CC and DD. So what ends up happening, you move the problem of spurious infinity to the social level, which then doesn't work. Now, I do definitely think you can fit Deleuze into Hegel in positive ways, but I'm not sure if you can fit Hegel into Deleuze as well, right? Because there are very real differences. So, and I think there is a lot of beauty and wonder and importance in Deleuze. The issue is that the solution to the problem of totalization in self-relating identity, he gives you a kind of solution to that problem, but at the expense of turning the social order into a spurious infinity of and. And this is where, like on the class with the common life, this is where for me, how exactly Hegel forms common life is super important, because then we look at Japan. Okay, Japan is fascinating. I kind of sometimes call that the logical end of meta-modernity, because I'm trying to use the sexy terms, which, I'm not sure what they mean, but they're sexy. And Greg Denver, I like his use of the term in different things. He's a good guy. But anyway, so Japan is so wild because you have an incredibly traditional culture, like extremely traditional, hard work, family, and different things. And then like really young people that are very kind of Deleuzian, and there's no middle, really. I mean, it's like really old or really young because people aren't having babies, right? And so what you end up happening is you get like the younger people are like, well, I'm not going to get married because I can't fit my understanding of who I am as a person in that traditional model. Indeed, because it could be smothering, like you mentioned, the sexuality for people like a religion or different things. So they're not going to do that. But then you're stuck in this, you can't relate because you're in that Deleuzian metaphysics and ontology, right? And so then you have the horigami. They stay in their room all day. It starts with an H. They don't leave their apartment. There's radical isolationism. I think there's like the average in Japan of old people that die and nobody knows they died is like 40 a week or something, and they find them 2 weeks later, like old people who die. Now, at the same time, suggesting the brilliance of Deleuze, I would argue you have an extraordinary art culture in Japan, though. Some of the best stories, some of the best movies, some of the best music. I can go into detail. I talked to Daniel Zaruba about that. So what you see is that a Deleuzian postmodern society gives you this double thing, exactly kind of how Deleuze saw it, where art and creativity explode because you have essential difference that is expressing itself. So expression is huge. So the art is stupidly high quality, but it comes at the expense of the relations that make the society possible because it becomes a spurious infinity. Basically, that describes the whole West. Japan is just kind of further along. And the reason, without going too much into it, and Mr. Zaruba and I talked about it, is that Japan modernized without religion because of the great, they tried to accelerate the westernization of Japan at the beginning of the 20th century, but didn't have the shadow of Buddha to slow down the consequences of doing that in terms of a self-relating identity. So they actually got there quicker, even though they started westernizing later, because they didn't have the same tradition to hold them back. So that's a lot of claims I would have to defend, but if you take me for it, I'd appreciate it. Psychoanalysis is extremely important to bring in to Counter-Enlightenment thinking, because they understand that identity is usually rooted in self-deception, avoidance, and not actually getting what we call truth is what we want to be truth, so we don't have to face it. And all of them are going to be examining complicated mental gymnastics that we are freaking good at carrying out so that we can avoid the real, so that we don't encounter the real. And you see, because once you encounter the real, there's basically two options. One, lose it, have a pathological breakdown, or two, you basically have to go to Hegel, right? You basically have to start heading in a new understanding of how logic operates so that you can see that the ways that you understand things are very often in the business of concealing them. And this is where it's kind of funny because there's actually so much there's a lot of kind of Heideggerian stuff in Hegel. And then you're like, yeah, I have this feeling too. I'm reading the Science of Logic again. I'm like, did this just have everything in it already? That's how it feels like. You're like, was it all here? What the heck? So anyway, but I think psychoanalysis goes to show you that understanding that is the natural mode of knowing is way more in the business of ideology, preservation, avoiding things that would make us uncomfortable, self-relating identity, and that we don't naturally engage in reflection. As you know, the way that the concept is in service of ourself and a subject to keep us from truth in a manner that is pleasing. But here's the trick. Self-deception is fascinating. There's that book by Finnegan who wrote a book on self-deception. Self-deception is freaking fascinating because if you know you're self-deceiving yourself, then it doesn't work. So you have to somehow engage in self-deception without knowing you're doing self-deception. And how in the world does that work? And this is where I think psychoanalysis comes in. And then obviously with a deep, profound examination of desire, because I think desire is central, because basically self-deception almost has to be in service of desire. Rather it be a desire not to encounter the real, a desire of thinking that this will make me happy if I were to get it, and you deny all evidence that would show it would not. You know, the big other, you deny all evidence that the big other isn't in there. You know, the connection between desire, self-deception, and the avoidance of the real are strongly connected. So I think that is a field that indeed, if you go back to David Hume and you see him talking about sentiment and habit, all of these are kind of the subjects. These are material of psychoanalysis before that is a thing. You know, he's like, hey, you guys don't realize it, but you use thinking in service of concealing yourself from yourself. Did you know that? You should pay attention to that. And it sounds like when you read Hume, he's radically like a Derridian deconstructionist, but that's simply because of the historic moment that he's in, that it's more difficult to situate him. So that would be a way that I would situate those thinkers.
Yeah, I mean, I think like on this level, when we think about self-identity and deception, when we think about truth and the real, which Lacan says truth and the real do not overlap, which is really a tragic thing when you really think about it, and especially when you experience it. But all these things, and on also what you were saying about Hume in terms of thinking in service of concealment, To me, I can't think about these things outside of a dialectical logic because, like, for example, with a partner or a wife or with children, questions of concealment and revealing, like thinking to conceal or thinking to reveal, truth and the real, fantasy and the real, deception and truth. All of these things, to me, I can only think about them dialectically, because if you push one of them to an extreme, it doesn't make any sense. Like, again, like for example, just on a day-to-day level, if you have a partner or something like that, do you just reveal every thought that runs through your head, even if you're unconsciously aware of it or consciously aware of it? There's an art to concealment. There's an art to revealing. There's an this logical process, I think, and when we think about also fantasy, desire, all of these things, to me, my basic point is it's hard to think of any of these things outside of a dialectical logic, which is, I guess, precisely to your point, that when you encounter the real, what do? Fall apart or enter dialectical logic of some kind? And
that's right.
And I think that's, I guess that at least intellectually, that's where I fall, is that either I'm going to fall apart or either I'm going to make my identity in some sense dialectical. I do think that there's also this like mega philosophical question of the non-dialectical core of dialectics.
Yes. Yeah.
This is a mega philosophical topic.
That's it.
To me, following Zizek, that's the dimension of the drive, is that you get the non-dialectical core of the dialectic itself. And there you have some, also you could put repetition compulsion there and things like this. It's a very strange dimension because it's not exactly blind instinctual logic. It's not blind instinctual logic, but at the same time, there's a weird, almost machinic dimension to the repetition. Anyway, but that's maybe for another time.
But well, just as a little note, the way I've been thinking about that, you just pointed to what to me is like the crazy thing. So, okay, so we've learned in the phenomenology of spirit that dialectical thinking is basically thinking. If you're not doing that, you're not really even thinking. But then we enter into the science of logic, and this is the question. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have concluded that dialectical thinking is basically the only thinking. What must the conditions of being be so that dialectical thinking is basically the only thinking? Well, now we're in spectacle reason, and boy, howdy, is this fun. So, and this is why, living by the ontoepistemology of the phenomenology of spirit is completely valid, because you are in a phenomenology, right? So the AB logic that comes from that, all the stuff I talk about, the absolute choice, that follows. But this is almost what I've started calling Hegel's unknown. Like, it's the unknown territory. It's like Hegel's like, all right, hey guys, we're going over there. We're going to try to figure out the conditions that make dialectical thinking the only kind of thinking. You're like, what? And you're like, yeah, we're going. Come on. And this is where actually I just wanted to note, I think it's really, really important where he opens the beginning on the being and nothing becoming with the ansem. He talks about the ontological argument. This is very important. I was actually blown away when I returned to that, because that's been a big deal on me, where he's like, hey, Kant, when you say that existence is a predicate, you're operating according to determinist being. You already have a determinate being where being and nothing are separate, and you're using that. What Anselm is unveiling to you is that God is a being of whom you cannot think doesn't exist, meaning he is a concept of which only has meaning outside of the traditional categories of determinate being. Now, you can say that that doesn't exist. You can do that. You can say that the concept of a necessary being doesn't correspond with reality. But how do you know? According to what? Oh, categories that you've derived from the being, the determinacy that you've encountered? Oh, isn't that funny? You're assuming that those categories actually correspond with every possible configuration of how a being could be, right? Well, wait a minute, Hegel. So what are you saying? He's like, yeah. So, we have to start thinking categories. Like Anselm is suggesting that if God exists, he's not a being that falls within the categories of being and nothing, right? He has a different calibration of being, of which is not divisible. Well, if it's not divisible, then it's necessary. If it's simple, it's necessary, right? So basically, he's kind of suggesting that whatever it is, the conditions that make dialectical thinking the thinking are somehow freaking non-divisible, simple being. And that sounds like drive, and this is where it gets fun. This is where it gets great.
I think in this section, which I really enjoy some of his reflections in the opening here, but I think one of the things that comes across clearly is when he almost pleads at the end of this meditation on Kant and God for consciousness to stop applying categories of finite being onto God.
Yep.
And I think that's really important is because and that actually might be my resistance to religion in general. Like traditionally speaking, I've had a certain I have a personal relationship to many dimensions of religion, and that's an ongoing process and for another conversation perhaps. But I have a strong reaction against a lot of what I hear from religious consciousness. I think precisely because of this using a finite consciousness using categories to talk about God is to me usually that there's something that doesn't sit right for me. And we don't need to go too much further into that, but that's an interesting part of the book. What we could go further into though is post-Hegelian philosophy, because you bring up post-Hegelian philosophy, and we've talked already a little bit about it. You bring up figures like Heidegger, Deleuze, Foucault, Derrida, and you say that this thinking is not equivalent to the Counter-Enlightenment. So I'm very interested in this claim, because one of my potential goals in the Future of Philosophy portal is to investigate more deeply 20th century philosophy, after having sort of had a deep foundations in Hegel and Nietzsche and psychoanalysis, and then go deeper into what 20th century philosophy was. So, I mean, what do you make of this? You say these figures are not the equivalent of Counter-Enlightenment.
Brilliant. I think a great way to think of Hegel, in the same way that you're saying that religion using categories to talk about God makes you uncomfortable about it, it's as if Hegel's like, the way that philosophy uses categories to justify itself makes him uncomfortable. So there's a way in which both are making a similar move, and it's so important to understand that Ansell's ontological proof was never called a freaking proof. It is simply something, and it starts with him getting on his knees. So Ansel comes basically saying, just like Augustine, going, it's really important. Both of them start basically saying, I have no idea what I'm talking about when I talk about God, because I use categories I can't justify. So God, I'm here, show me what's up. And so both of them come from a place of, I have no idea what I'm doing. And basically that's a similar spirit of humility, I think, that Hegel's like saying. He's like, let's not be so sure that these categories we derive from objects are rightly applied back on those objects in a manner that actually gets at what's going on. And I think that's a similar sort of move there. But once you do that and you start going, you can't use like you talked about drive. Well, we use all these finite categories to understand God. Well, what if we can't use the categories we think we can to understand drive? The categories we think we can to understand like how human beings understand the world, right? Well, everything starts opening up, man. This is where stuff gets kind of nuts. And I think Hegel understood that. Now, to the question, I am not saying that 20th century philosophy has no value in it or that it's wrong, nor am I necessarily saying that the modern Counter-Enlightenment is right about everything. Those are different matters, right? But the main crux of it, and in fact, I think there are certain postmodern thinkers, like if we take Derrida at his best, I think very much overlays with Maurice Blondel, for example. There's a lot of similarities there. Not that I'm saying he stole from him. One comes to their ideas and they come to their ideas, right? The difference is that post-modernity is going to be suggesting correctly that self-relating identity, or A is A logic, is problematic and causes oppression or pathologies, or could be used for control. So let's take Foucault. Foucault is going to be saying, look, we create, the elites basically create notions of sexual normality. They impose it upon other people while they don't do it themselves. So this idea of kind of a coherent logic by which you operate sexually is just used to control people, right? You have Derrida come along who says, hey, dichotomy, say, between being and nothing. Derrida would be, I don't know if Derrida read The Science of Logic. Derrida actually apparently was famous for not reading books. He was like, he read Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, but he said he read very few books, but the ones he read, he knew very well, whatever. But basically, Derrida understood very well that dichotomies capture thought. say, between being and nothing, and that deconstructing that is really, really important. Here's the problem. A lot of the correct impulses of the 20th century, so you have the early 20th century, that if we have, say, you have existentialism, you have thinkers like Heidegger who's going to be writing. So you have like these strains of people that, one, on the existential side, are understanding the problems of the Enlightenment and leaving out the subject, right? And then you have another side of things, if it's, say, Marxist, that's having a certain reading of Hegel that is arguably problematic, that's going to have a unifying, rationality, if we could just make people rational or have a process of arriving at the rational, we would arrive at the best. So let's go that way, which of course is just a continuation of the dream of the Enlightenment in problematic ways. And I think Horkheimer and Adorno and Dialectics of the Enlightenment are very good on that. And then obviously Benjamin Fondane as well. Or you have a Heidegger direction that's like, okay, all of Western thought has made some sort of fundamental mistake, and let's try to clear it aside. And that's kind of counter-enlightenment, right? But the problem is it can't move into the A-B logic of Hegel, so it does the clearing, which then unfortunately can lead to fascism, right? Where you're trying to clear aside and get back to the old and get to the true people and the true blood and the true land and get down to things, and then you get a problem. Or you have the existential side that's like, all of this sucks, and then and all of this sucks. So it's just like it. Or you have you could have like existential Christianity. So all of these a lot of the 20th century, when it's at its best, tends to be notions that A logic is bad, but they don't have the resources to negate, sublate it into a different program that doesn't end up in an effacement of a kind. So that's the issue. Whereas when one looks at the science of logic, he's like, yeah, we have to, you're right, Derrida, we have to escape that. Okay, hey, yes, we have to clear aside some of the 2,000 years of logic, which of course for Hegel is metaphysics. We have to clear those aside, but then we have to negate, sublate it into a different ground and a different logical structure. So a way to look at this, and then I'll give it back to you, is that the modern counter-enlightenment understood deconstructing A as A was not enough. Nor was it good to have a modernist project of trying to actually do A as A in a totalizing vision, right? So that's postmodernity. So postmodernity and all that deconstructs A as A when it's at its best. But the modern counter-enlightenment, which I would align, like I'm saying, Hegel realized there's another step you have to do. And that would be the negation, sublation of AA into AB. And that's what's missing from the 20th century. Now, there's a funny way in which I don't understand it perfectly, but a lot of these, it depends on what you mean, again, by meta-modernity and this oscillation between modernity and oscillation, different things. The best parts of that, I would argue, are actually very much like the counter-enlightenment. That there's the modern counter-enlightenment. The best parts of that are very like it. The problem is a lot of this new meta-modernity thought, in my opinion, I'm not talking for everyone, is unaware of a tradition that it actually might be able to connect up with, so that it can have a stronger foundation that is not merely aware that there's problems with postmodernity. Because a lot of meta-modernity, to me, and I am speaking from my experience, I'm not speaking for everyone. I bought Brendan's book. I'll read his book. Looking forward to it. I know there's a lot of different thinkers. A lot of meta-modernity is simply arising from a realization that postmodernity is not enough. It's very negative, okay? Like it's kind of a negative thing to it. It's like, well, we need to figure out how this oscillation can do something more. Okay, that's good, but now what is the logical underpinnings of that? And it's just, again, that's the step you have to take. That, of course, it seems like Hegel 200 years ago knew you had to do because he's just ahead of everything, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be, it's got to be weird to be Hegel. I mean, it's got to be weird. It's got to be weird. I mean, and not saying I have experience in that direction either, or in that way, but that he must have had to endure. I mean, he clearly understood the limits of the understanding, and to the point where his natural cognition flowed in such a way is that he probably didn't care if other people understood him or not. Mm-hmm. And that has to be probably one of his great personal sacrifices in his life to get as far as he did. Now, in terms of like your recounting of the 20th century philosophy, you have emphasis on clearing without replacing it with anything else. You have emphasis on sort of an existentialism. Well, this all sucks. The only way in which you could clear and then replace, and the only way in which you could rise above the horribleness of existence, is if you understood the objectivity of the concept, I think.
Right.
I think so that, like that, and it's coming to be through mechanisms of sublation, and it's well, I guess we'll have other times to talk specifically about my personal relationship to sublation and the logic of the objective concept, but it's hard. It's still hard to think about what steps could be taken practically to, I don't know if institute is the right word, but pointing in the direction of some sort of social level, collective level, practical application of ideas of sublation and the coming to be of the objective concept. I mean, the first thing that does come to mind is that psychoanalysis is not a bad shot. It's not a bad attempt. Now,
No.
it fails, I think, ultimately, but the question of what do we do simply is still very much there. Other than on a personal level, I can answer that understanding this mechanism of sublation and understanding sort of the coming to be of my objective concept are very helpful for moving through my day-to-day life and enduring certain negativities. It's certainly very helpful in that direction. As it relates to metamodernity, sort of not being aware of more of tradition and connecting more with the foundation. To me, my impression of metamodernity is that it's too egotistical self-positing. Like we're metamodernists, like this is metamodernity, we're metamodernists, rather than, and I brought this up in the conversation with Layman Pascal, is that postmodernism is not so much a paradigm that intellectuals were identifying with. It was more a symptomal identification, like for example, again going back to Lyotard's original paper on the critiquing grand narratives. He's more saying that the contemporary environment is so complex that grand narratives no longer function for modern subjectivity or postmodern subjectivity. That's like postmodern subject, like you could, like we are postmodernists whether we like it or not, whether we identify with it or not. So right. something like metamodernity to me would have to have that. It would have to have that similar, and it could be that we're metamodern. It could be that we're metamodern, and it's like a sort of an ironic distancing towards the real, like sure. maybe that's where we are. I maybe want to get your comment before moving on to another topic on what do you think about this, the way metamodernity relates to the category of irony.
Few things. That was all really excellent. So very important. If indeed progress has helped us arrive at these paradoxes that now are actually the achievements of progress that we can think through. Modernism, postmodernity, metamodernity, all of these are contingently very good things, depending on how we rise to the occasion of encountering the paradox and how we internalize that. Do we view the paradox as an evidence that we did something wrong, or is it a disclosing of the thing that we now need to integrate into our understanding of life, right? As opposed to like with the anatomies of reason, the autonomies of reason, as Kant talks about, or achievements of reason, right? So all of this is contingent. Like, so for example, I think a lot of Heidegger's thinking on clearing is really, really good. And I think there's something true about if you clear things aside, there's a notion that something will come forth. Well, I would argue that would come forth is freaking AB, basically. The problem is, and this is the $1 million question, and actually I would say this about Hume, it is very difficult to get from, if you just stay in Hume's common life, okay? And you try to extrapolate that to a global political project, I hate to say it, it's going to be real hard to avoid Dugin's fourth political theory. And you see, basically, the common life stuff, this is why I'm so interested in the subject, is because in Hegel we find, and this would be kind of opening the class in different subjects as well. In Hegel, we find a way possibly to take seriously the necessity of the concrete in common life for the grounding of identity in self and having it be in relation with other common lives without it being duganistic or segregationist or isolationist, and actually having relations, or it could even be Deleuzian, right? This is the mega question. And you were also saying, what does it look like to do all this on an institutional level? And what does it look like to do all this on, of course, would next be an economic level? Indeed, that is what needs to be thought. That's a big deal. And you see, for me, again, Layman, I loved your talk with Layman Pascal, and I love Layman Pascal. Like every time he talks, I'm like, I love this guy. He's so great. So when I'm talking about metamodernity, I do not mean to say that metamodernity is not good or it doesn't have benefits to it. However, if metamodernity, and this is contingent, I'm not saying this is what people think, but if metamodernity solution to say what is called the meta crisis or the meaning crisis, if the solution is we will have everyone become choral, as say the color and spiral dynamics, or everyone will gain a elevated rationality that can handle paradox. Well, basically, then that just means that everyone has to think the same way, right? And that would basically be the dream of modernism in disguise. If we could just make everyone rational, then, the world would be perfect, right? We'd have the utopian state. Yeah, if the solution to the meta crisis is indeed everyone gains the rationality that is able to handle difference and complexity and not be overwhelmed, that is a kind of modernist dream in disguise, right? And so that can be a kind of risk of it, as opposed to saying, no, there are certain material conditions that generate a way of being that is not bound to a self-relating identity, right? And this is where I like to talk about difference between spiral dynamics and cone dynamics and all of these economic and social, and like we really have to take seriously the material conditions that people are living in and how those incubate certain towardness in the world and the ability to handle difference in things like that. Now, again, I'm not saying that people in those communities don't think that way, but you have to take seriously the common life in the concrete to incubating a way of being. So, for example, I would argue that a lot of people that have personalities that can handle difference well have access to the internet. The internet is a material condition that changes the way that you're able to encounter difference, right? Well, if you want to make everyone have a consciousness that's better able to handle the meta crisis, then you really, really should be pushing for government funding for spreading Wi-Fi or turning it into something that's widely available for lots of people so that they can physically encounter difference. It's just like at colleges, people tend to encounter people different from them that make them go, well, maybe my worldview isn't the fundamental truth of reality. Maybe I need to take seriously other people. And they emotionally feel the reality of difference, which then changes how they think, right? So I would put a big emphasis on material conditionality for changing how people approach the world in different things like that. And I think that really has to be emphasized in very important ways. And in Hegel, that can come out, because I think when you bring it to the philosophy of right, you have this movement of the state to bringing more and more difference under the same umbrella to where things can come together. And then the question is, how does that difference live together without killing one another, right? So that it can kind of work and think together in a manner that does not actually become pathological or very, very problematic. So those would be some of the thoughts on metamodernity that I would just kind of add to it. And to also say, lastly, is that a lot of the solution is sort of like a new kind of religion, like a kind of a new religious way to do things, or to have a new spiritual practice and to cultivate a new consciousness. I think all of that indeed can be good. But then the question becomes, does that mean everyone only gains the kind of consciousness needed to handle the world today if they do those certain religious practices? How are you going to convince everyone to do that? How are you going to give everyone the imperative that that's something they need to engage in or that they need to do or different things? Well, that can also become kind of forceful, or can be kind of pushing people in that different direction.
Right. I mean, I think so there's a few things, I guess, to comment on there. It's interesting that you see the limits of Hume's common life in the political project potentially leading to something like a Dugin's fourth political theory, and it makes me excited a little bit to push after the Science of Logic course towards Hegel's philosophy of right, and going deeper into Hegel's political thought, and even further into the future, going deeper into Hegel's later lectures on art and later lectures on religion and things like that. I think that this overall Hegelian project that I'm trying to run with Philosophy Portal still has quite a little bit of steam left in it. And indeed, we get brought to the most fundamentally intractable social economic problems when it comes to thinking large-scale politics and economics. And of course, Hegel's work inspired that in some sense with Marxism, but also in some sense we can say that failed. And so we're encountering levels upon levels of failure here. And when it comes to the internet, I think really the problem to me, when you say, like, I agree in principle, so I have a paper in my PhD thesis called The Global Commons. And I think the commons as a political category should replace communism. So it's not that we idealize social community, but we think about common resources and common problems that affect all human beings, that hold us in common. So, for example, the internet should be seen as a commons, for example. I'm not against that. And that I also agree that the more you go online, the more you're forced to encounter differences. However, I would say in the modern context of the internet, one of the big problems is people forming tribes, basically, because they can't handle so much difference. Right. So they form a tribe, and that tribe can become very pathological and very insular. And I think the question does become more on the end of, how does all this difference come together without killing each other? I think at the core of a lot of the tradition, what I perceive as traditional regressive tendencies, is people trying to get some sort of stable, coherent, totalizing identity in the face of overwhelming difference, where you don't know how to deal with all this difference without killing each other. So I think these are really fundamental problems, and certainly they bring us to perhaps the limits of contemporary thought. I'd let you have a comment on that if you want.
Well, I just want to add, no, I 100% agree. And this is why, although I have great sympathies toward the materialism, the material dialectic, material history of a Marx or different things, because I do think material conditions have a radical impact on who people become. I think it is, though, very problematic where you've missed this feedback loop between idea and materiality that is included in Hegel, where, yes, the common life is very, but this is another reason why I had to move beyond the sky, as much as I didn't want to move beyond the Hume and different things. The material condition of your common life is not enough for making self-evident how you relate to others that are truly different from you. Right? Like, that's the problem that you're having. You have to have the idea or the logic that somehow makes different essential to your identity. And that is what is missing. It will, yes, I think access to the internet exposes people to difference in a manner that can be beneficial. But unless they have the Hegelian logic
also
of AB,
terrifying.
Exactly. They're just going to react to that terror into tribes. So this is the problem. The internet, you see, it's very, there's kind of like, we almost have, to language it, it's almost like an autonomous conditionality where we're like, if we meet this condition, then everything will be okay. No, it's one condition of many. Yes, people having access to connectability, information, that's all well and good. But it also might just be hell, right? Because they're overwhelmed by difference and there is a pathological response. This is why going back, returning to Hegel, it seems so important, because you have this logic that creates a feedback loop, if you will, between materiality and idea that says you have to have both, but the bothness has to be situated in a concretion, something common, not just the abstract. It has to be lived. And this is where the uniqueness of Hegel, for me, the uniqueness of Hegel doesn't come out except embedded in a common life. That's where Hume is important. Like, it is embedded in commitment, in everyday, so that you're not just understanding things according to categories, but understanding them according to their unfolding it before you by their own terms, right? Well, you have to be committed to a common life for that to occur, dang it. You have to be concrete in order for that to occur. But if it were to occur and you don't have the ideas from Hegel to understand what is occurring, then it's going to miss you, right? It's not going to be there. So if you have access to the internet, but you don't have the AB logic by which to not just run from difference into tribe, or to use the internet to fall into conspiracies or different things like that, then the very thing that can be part of the conditionality to move you in to progress can be what destroys you. Right? That's the key with a kind of paradoxical progress, is that progress progresses according to steps, that every step has the potential of destruction in it. But that is the only way to progress. The only way to progress is by the risk of destruction. We tend to think that progress is leaving destruction behind. Like you progress because there's less chance of destruction or less chance of pathology. The genius of Hegel is that progress occurs thanks to the increase of the probability of pathology and destruction, and that's the key.
I really think that's a lesson that actually is it's really post World War II society that has to hear that message. I made that point in one of my recent Science of Logic lectures, which seemed to resonate very strongly. But it is this, and I have to admit, as growing up as a teenager and as a young adult underneath a type of progressive liberalism, there really is operating in a leftist liberalism a type of naive progressivism without negativity. And so to think progress inclusive of catastrophe, there's a necessary component of it. And it's actually because progress is uniquely linked to catastrophe at every step. That's what calls forth the type of ideal subject or the objective concept of the subject. The objective concept of the subject needs to be birthed out of that out of that catastrophe, and it's the response to that catastrophe. Otherwise, I mean, and that's just, it just brings you to the most devastating aspects of our day-to-day life and the tragedy in some sense of our situation.
Well, basically, a global commons almost has to make the commons the negativity. That's the kind of crazy
that's
move.
my view. That's my view. Yeah, that's my view, and that's actually why I would support. Because I hear a lot of people pushing back at Zizek in different ways, but from different angles. But I actually support, at the end of Zizek's career, he is forwarding a political project, and he's stayed away from forwarding a political project up until now, but he is forwarding a political project now, and he calls it disaster communism. And I like this idea of disaster communism because it's not a and I think it's so, like, I have a paper again called Global Brain in the Global Commons, where I try to categorize different domains of the commons related to, like, for example, technology. You have large scale automation, which affects everyone on the planet. On the social level, you could have various levels of immigration, which ecology, global warming, they're all different dimensions of the commons. But we can't think about global politics in a utopian sense that we're going to overcome all of these gaps for a harmonious totality. Right. It's rather that we need to think about the global negativities which link us all. And if we can't think about the global negativities which link us all, then there's going to be no possibility of a global political project. No. So I think, and like, as it relates to the idea of disaster communism, I mean, I think that's an interesting idea to think in the context of, like, the coronavirus pandemic, where we need to reify the coronavirus pandemic, but think about the nature of that pandemic. It affected everyone on the planet. Nobody saw it coming, and it required almost an immediate global reaction. So I think what we need to do is get used to that type of phenomena where a small perturbation, nobody anticipated it, nobody really thought of it, but it affects the whole global community instantaneously. And we need not a utopian communist thinking, but a disaster communist thinking.
I think everything you're saying is extremely important. So if the modernist dream is dead, and we saw all the bodies that laid, which is a totalizing project, so you can't have a global state based on AA. But we also see where post-modernity doesn't have enough positive resources to give an identity, so you just fall away into individual self-relations that then get you Japan, like we're talking about. But then we also see, if you grant me, the Dugin project, which is basically a kind of common life, and he'll talk about many Daseins and different things. So
Russian truth, you'll have Western truth, you'll have Russian truth. They're different truths.
And they're all different. And then the idea is that they separate and they
get
along.
Postmodern. That's so postmodern traditionalism.
There is the gentleman who talks about conservative postmodernism,
African
Robert,
truth, Indian truth.
There is a kind of conservative postmodernism. I haven't written a paper on it, but you're exactly right. And I think Dugan is not anti, people like, oh, he's anti-West. Well, it depends on what you mean by that. I mean, he very much is integrating many Western thinkers, but there's a kind of postmodern conservatism. It's very interesting. But the only option out of that, if you're not going to do one of those three, and this is why I don't see how you avoid Hegel as much as I wanted to. I've told you before, like I read Hegel, and I was like, I would have never dreamed that a decade later you come back to Hegel and you're like, okay, here we are. Of course it's all here. Of course it's all here. But you see, basically Hegel talks about a global state, if you will, based on the without B. I was talking about A does not equal A equals A does not equal A without B. Okay, so the negativity is you are without the stable state. All right, but the very withoutness is what makes possible the stability of identity enough in change and becoming, so you can have it in conceptual ability, so you can have the ability to think. That negativity, which then entails a perpetual active becoming, precisely in its inability to fully realize that, then has to be the ground of, like you're saying, the global interaction is that shared negativity. That is not a thought that is currently on the radar of people. Now, what exactly does it look like to have an economic model of which is based on negativity as such, or a sociological structure as such, or an individual identity? Well, this is belonging again. I think you get into stuff like self-forgetting as opposed to selfish or selfless. I think you get into the pricing mechanism of horizons, I think comes into account. I think you get into the nature of then, of course, trade deals and different things, because what does it mean to trade with people who share in your negativity? There is a whole host of topics that can come up. I actually do think there are some, as strange as it sounds, I actually do think there is some practical, to use that word in this context is funny, but there is actually some ways that one can mobilize systems to take that seriously. But we're not certainly going to do that if we don't agree that that is the right conceptual framework to think about the problem. That's why these conversations matter, because all practice takes place within a conceptual framework. And right now, the three main conceptual frameworks are still trying to totalize somehow postmodern conservatism, or basically the global state, or neoliberal. Or I know neoliberal is a loaded term, but you have people are doing practices according to certain philosophical schemas. The point that we're bringing up is introducing the possibility of practice according to a shared negativity and taking that seriously, which would bring by AB logic. But if the world doesn't even agree on that, well, then of course that's not going to be implemented, and stuff will go down. So framing it correctly, I think, is very important.
Yeah, it's difficult in that ecology of terms where the third was the neoliberal state. You have the totalizing tendency, you have the conservative postmodernism, and you have the neoliberal state. Zizek more and more is talking about what he's calling self-revolutionizing capital. Actually, like, what's more revolutionary than leftist politics today is self-revolutionizing capital. Like, for example, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, yes. and blockchain ledgers, and who knows what's going to happen with all of this with this stuff. But it seems to be like the again, sort of every catastrophe, and this is sort of like why I think Zizek always makes the point that capitalism is very Hegelian, is because it seems to progress through its own catastrophes. Like, yes. Every catastrophe it confronts, it seems to grow, expand, become more powerful and stuff like that. So it's not a very bright sort of idea in some sense. It can be a depressing idea, but on some level, I do think this shared negativity does have to be situated within this idea of self-revolutionizing capital. Is yes. that we have to think this together as well. But I mean,
this would bring me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just as a comment, this would bring me to where, like, again, I have utmost respect for a lot of the thinkers that do meta-modernity. For me, in taking seriously material condition, like when we talk about, or Vervaeke or different people talk about a new religion, right? Like a kind of new religion. I myself would like a new pricing mechanism and focus all the mental energies on a new pricing mechanism, which is I call the pricing problem of horizons, which gets into the Bitcoin and all of this different stuff. And then we have to go into those mechanisms. Whereas when it comes to religion, I guess I feel like there's enough resources in pre-existing religions to reform them, actually, as opposed to making a new one. And so that would be, now I'm not saying a new religion kit is necessarily bad, but one has to choose where they're going to reform and where they're going to create something new. And I personally feel as if it would be probably more useful. Not that it can't be individually useful to do new religions. I think focusing on economics for the newness and then reforming religious traditions that are pre-existing is probably a more useful use of time. Now, I don't want to bash anyone's project. That's just how I feel, because I feel like you can definitely reform reform pre-existing religions to not be Gnostic. Just my view, but
it's certainly a difficult topic. I think, like, for the style of subjectivity which is going to be attracted to meta-modernity, I think they have a hard time, let's say, authentically believing in the traditional religions. Sure. Like, I think that's where some of the resistance comes in, but certainly that's a really important conversation, and I definitely see a lot of logic in reforming what we already have over building something totally from scratch, because we do have a religious infrastructure and a religious architecture, and I do think that we should, for those who feel pulled in that direction, I mean, it can be a fantastic resource. So say on a final point, just want to say again, I'll leave the link to the description of your Counter-Enlightenment article in the description, so that, because this was the base for a lot of the things we talked about. So if you want to read more directly what Daniel's talking about there, check that out. And just basically using the science of logic as a foundation for thinking sort of the Counter-Enlightenment, meaning sort of a counter to a type of totalizing light of reason. Including being and nothing fundamentally as this oscillation, which is required to sublate in order to really become. And also say that this whole conversation is part of a little mini conversation series I'm having. Already had one with Layman Pascal to prepare for the Science of Logic course, which starts January 16th, 2023. There'll be a link in the description to that if you're also interested in joining. Daniel will be teaching, as well as Layman and others. I just want to say, thanks for coming on, Daniel. And do you have any sort of final thoughts on our conversation and these ideas of science of logic and the Counter-Enlightenment?
Well, first, I have had a wonderful time, as I always do, speaking with you, and I love going through all these different topics. And I appreciate your desire to talk about the paper and to make the paper central to the conversation. A few things. I think it's just very important to note that no one is necessarily, in Hegel, none of these things that we've described, like modernism, postmodernism, meta-modernity, all these things are quote unquote wrong. The issue is that they have to fit into an understanding of the necessity of the paradox as being the very mechanism of progress, of which then, rather than trying to overcome the paradox, you actually see the paradox as somehow essential to the unfolding of the concept. And this is where it's nuts. Like Hegel, whereas, Kant might be like, paradox is evidence that reason has been screwed up. He's like, well, what if something about the paradox is the structure of reason? Oh, and what if there's something about the structure of paradox that's also the structure of nature? And what if that means like the idea and nature somehow share a structure, not in a representative way, but in a kind of dance partner way, where they're dancing one another, but they have enough similarity of structure to make that dance possible? That's some crazy stuff, right? Yeah, that's some crazy stuff. Well, then it really matters what ideas we have. It really matters what we think. And it really matters, again, I understand the sentiment of going, Hegel is really, really hard. Indeed, it is very difficult. I'm not going to say I'm an expert at it. It's also really difficult to exercise. It's really difficult to go to the gym. But what happens if you don't go to the gym and exercise? There are consequences. There are real consequences. And likewise,
tell me about it.
I know. Yeah, I know. I did cross country for a long time, and I remember when I could run. But likewise, there are very real consequences for not moving into an AB logic. And it's hard and it's weird and it's paradoxical. Failure to do so means that we don't even have the idea that paradox is the nature of progress. That's not even on our radar. And if indeed Hegel is right, that somehow paradox is essential to being, if you grant me that term, then that means we don't even have as an option in our thinking today something that will not efface us, because everything is therefore against the very structuring of what it means to be a human being and what it means to be a human being in the encounter of the idea with nature. So there are real consequences here, and ideas, Mr. Weaver is correct, ideas have consequences. So everyone, please take the Science of Logic class, sign up today. Cadell Last is magnificent, and I've had a great time talking with him.
All right, thanks so much, Daniel. So yeah, again, just reiterating there, that the Science of Logic course starts on January 16th. Again, link in the description to that. Layman will be teaching with me. Daniel will be teaching. Also Thomas Hammelrick, Alex Ebert, William Rupish, and I still have some conversations ahead with Thomas and Alex to look forward to before the course starts. So again, thank you for coming on, Daniel. I thought it was really helpful here to discuss your paper, The Counter-Enlightenment, and get a sort of larger picture here of where we're thinking about the science of logic philosophically, and also had quite an extensive conversation about how this might help us think global politics, global logic in general. So thank you again, and thanks for everyone who's still watching. And
well, thank you, Cadell. I've enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone. This has been a blast. Thank you so much.
All right.